So, welcome on in, everyone, to our back to school webinar for sophomores. We're really excited to be here tonight. My name is Jim Wismer. I'm the director of Ivy Experience. The main hat I wear here is that I oversee our test prep and school subject tutoring, and I work with a lot of our families on putting together their plans for standardized testing. Karan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Karan Shah. I'm one of the founders here at Ivy Experience, along with Eric Carlin, who's not on this webinar with us. In terms of working with students, I still handle some of the tutoring with some students. I also handle a decent amount of our personal advising meetings with our freshmen and sophomores.
Awesome. So we're excited to have you here today because I think sophomore year is a fun time in high school because it's when things really start to get real. Back to school freshman year is all about getting your feet under you. There's a lot of unknown, and you're just trying to kind of acclimate to a new environment as well as you can. It's a little bit anxious at that time. The start of sophomore year, you can start more from a position of strength. So students are really able to, have seen what high school is like for a year and go into the year with a little bit more of a game plan for what success is going to look like for them. So, with that in mind, if you've ever been to one of our webinars, this slide is going to look awfully familiar. We typically start by just zooming out and talking about, what is actually in a student's control when it comes to college admissions. So there are various things that come into play in college admissions that are outside of a student's control. We all know this. Things like your demographic information, where other students at your high school are applying to college, government decisions about international students and things like that. All of these things are going to factor into the broader picture of college admissions in some way, shape, or form and could influence whether you're admitted at a university in particular. But there is nothing you can do about any of that. So when it comes to actually putting time and energy into this process to improve your chances, these are the six things that students should really be focused on. So that would be grades and the academic rigor of their coursework, letters of recommendation from teachers, standardized test scores, extracurricular activities, college essays and applications, and their college list. And really, the more time you can put into these factors, the better your chances are going to be. We're going to talk about heading into 10th grade, what you can do and what you should know about these factors. Of course, not everything is urgent right now. You're not going to be writing any college essays anytime soon, but you should have an idea of kind of what to expect and when. So this will be our kind of guiding force throughout the evening. And we like to start this off by talking about kind of the main factor in college admissions, which is your performance on your high school transcript, the grades you get in class, and the rigor of your coursework. So, generally speaking, this makes up the bulk of a student's academic record, which is also kind of supplemented by standardized test scores. In the sophomore year, what you should really be thinking about is how did that freshman year transition to high school go last year? And were there any rough spots that you'll need to quote unquote clean up? Your performance this year will also influence your course selection for junior year. Junior year is generally considered to be the most important year from a college admission standpoint because you're going to be closer to college freshman you next year than you are this year. But your 10th grade grades are going to matter a lot too. Just keep in mind, one of the important things to know here is that the start of senior year matters also. And I say that, we're far off from senioritis on this call, but we have this conversation with families so often that it bears repeating as often as possible. Colleges do see your grades from the beginning of senior year, so make sure you're not slacking off. Now, one of the most important things to talk about with respect to grades and the way that colleges evaluate them is grade inflation. And this, I would say, is one of the biggest disconnects that I see when I speak with parents about student performance in terms of their perception of, kind of the state of things in high schools and college admissions. What I have here is a graph of over time, the percentage of college freshmen in America who had at least an A minus average in high school. And we can see that back in 1966, it was about 21.8%. And now in 2024, the last full year we have data for, it's 84% of high school students have at least an A minus average. So one of the common conversations I have when we start talking about standardized testing with families is, oh, my student's a really strong student, but not a great test taker. And their test taking doesn't reflect their ability in the classroom. And I ask a little bit more information, and the family might, tell me a score that is just about an average SAT score, which would be in the roughly 1000s range. And then they'll tell me the student is a mostly A student with a couple Bs. And I, a mostly A student with a couple of Bs, it is about an A minus average, which means you're in this 84%. So the thing about that kind of grade point average is that you're in the top 84% of the country, which means essentially that all that really tells someone is that it's not the bottom 16%. Whereas a median test score, that's we'd expect a student with a roughly A minus average to have a roughly median test score because it's going to be a roughly median GPA in this day and age. Now, grading is a cultural practice, and we've decided as a culture that what was A work in 1966 is different from what is A work in 2024. So these things change over time, and we can sit here and be old men screaming at the clouds about how it was way harder when we were in school, parents. And there's some truth to that in terms of the grades, at least. There's definitely a lot about high school now that's much more difficult. But I say this just to kind of contextualize the broader conversation around grades. And it's important to know kind of what you're up against in this world. Most students will be applying to college with roughly an A average. So when we talk about most students applying to college with a roughly A average, I have here data from the University of Pittsburgh. And this is an example I use because a lot of our students are based in the Pennsylvania area. And this is one of the popular state schools that'll end up on a lot of our students' college lists. And what we can see here is that 61% of students who enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh had a 4.0 or higher GPA. And the average GPA of a freshman going to the University of Pittsburgh was 4.08%. Now, this is a weighted GPA. So an unweighted GPA is going to be obviously different. It can't go over 4.0 the same way a weighted GPA can. But it just goes to show you that, at a competitive school like University of Pittsburgh, but not one of the most competitive schools, their average freshman, admitted applicant is going to be getting in with over a 4.0.
So with all that being said, what does that mean, right? So let's say your freshman year didn't go as well as planned, as Jim talked about a little bit earlier. That adjustment from middle school to high school wasn't as smooth as you wanted it to be, right? That's okay. We're not all is lost. We need to now work harder the next couple of years, right? So as Jim mentioned, 11th grade grades are going to be the most important. That being said, they get more important as they go along, right? So let's say we had a couple classes that didn't go well freshman year. Here's the time to start to pick it up and kind of work a little bit harder, right? So we can improve those grades in both 10th and 11th grade so that colleges see as you've gone throughout your high school career, as you're even taking harder classes than you were in your freshman year, you're adapting to your new situation and you're improving the overall rigor of your courses, but you're also improving your grades as well. So don't worry if freshman year didn't go as planned. We still can work hard the next 2 years and kind of get where we want to be. The other thing to consider, and depending on how your high school does things in terms of math class structure, there is something to consider about what math track your student is on. A lot of students who are pursuing STEM, engineering, and even a lot of business programs will need to have taken calculus by the time they enter college. And so that means by senior year, they should have calculus on their transcript. What does that mean for you? Talk to your guidance counselor, talk to a college counselor at your school to see if you're on that track, right? And if you're not on that track to potentially take calculus by the end of your senior year, you may have to adapt a little bit, either do a little work over the summer or possibly be double up on some math to kind of get ahead in terms of being ready to apply to those programs when you get to the beginning of your senior year. Now, what does that lead to? That leads directly to course selection, right? So a lot of you are starting your new courses in the Philly area. Schools are starting this week. In some places down in the South, schools started a couple weeks ago. But for course selection next year, right, when it comes up, we need to figure out what's going to be best for your student, right? What will make your transcript the best it can be in junior year, but also one that a student can handle, right? The easy answer is to say, we'll take all the hardest classes, right? And that'll make my transcript look as difficult as possible. But that's not always the answer. Different students have different strengths. They have different weaknesses. They have classes they're more likely to excel in, classes they might struggle in a little bit, right? So it's about finding that right balance for each and every student and also based on their goals. If you are looking at some of those very top tier universities, and a lot of kids from your high school are applying to those top tier universities, you may be looking at checking off every AP or IB box, right? But if you're not in that sort of situation, it's about finding the right balance to make sure your grades are still at the level where the student can handle the course load. Now, with that being said, both this year and even next year, right? Say you're in a situation where you've decided to take a more rigorous course. You took the honors class instead of the regular class. You took the AP class instead of the honors class, right? If a month or two in, you realize, hey, this class is really difficult for me. It's just not working right now. It's not the best fit for me. And especially if the work you're having to put into that class is affecting all of your other grades as well, it might be worth it to think about and talking to your counselor about potentially dropping down a level, just so that not only can you get a better grade in that particular subject, but it's now not then affecting the rest of your grades and all of the other subjects as well.
So, what should we do about this fall? So the first thing I referenced earlier when we were talking, and I said, consider any rough patches from last year. So plan around your last year performance. If science was a struggle for you in ninth grade, it's likely to be an area of struggle again in 10th grade. So you want to kind of go into the year with a plan based on what your strengths and weaknesses have been shown to be. So you may go into the year thinking, I know I'm going to have to spend a little extra time. I'm going to have to see the teacher before or after school. I'm going to have to get a tutor to support in a particular subject area. Consider any finals or AP exams that you'll have. So, for example, if you are in a school that does a cumulative midterm and then a cumulative final, but the final's not cumulative with the midterm, that's going to be important for you to know as you're planning your studying. And I know it sounds crazy. Hey, we haven't stepped foot in a classroom yet in many cases, and we're talking about final exams. What's this guy talking about? I can tell you when you guys call me in March and we're panicked about, final exams, that thinking about this stuff throughout the year is really going to help you. The more you learn along the way and the better you master that material at the time you're focused on it, the less review you're going to have to do in that end of year crunch, which is always the most academically intense time of the school year. We joke, but it's not a joke. It's actually the truth that with our juniors every year who are doing SAT prep with us or ACT prep, we see the lowest homework completion rate in the spring months. And that's because they're so focused on trying to balance their test prep with so many competing priorities that end of school time is definitely the most academically busy. So again, you really help yourself by learning the material better along the way in terms of the amount of time you have to spend then. I recommend, for that reason, intervening early if needed. So, what does intervening mean? Reach out to your teacher first and foremost if you're struggling in a class. See if they have a free period or time before or after school where you can get additional support. That can come into play when it comes to letters of recommendation, which Karan will talk with us about in a little bit. Consider forming a study group. And I believe Karan was probably the same way, was that kid that always helped other students with their homework. And that's how we ended up, as giant nerds in the tutoring business. It, Generally speaking, even strong students benefit from studying with other students because teaching is a great way to learn. So if you're someone who needs help, reaching out to a friend who's more comfortable with that material can be a good thing. I'll never forget my freshman year biology class. My friend Nate called me and we talked on the phone, a landline, by the way, uh, for 3 hours reviewing the outline for the final exam. And it was just him asking me questions and me answering them. That was how I studied for the test, was helping a friend. So don't feel, ashamed or scared to ask a friend for help because it's generally going to benefit them as well. And failing those options, if you need extra support, that's when tutoring can help. When we talk about tutoring for a school subject, we're not just reviewing content. We want to help build skills that are going to help in the long run. We take a very teach you how to fish approach to tutoring, where we want to build the ability to study and learn in the long run that'll help you throughout the remaining years of high school and even through college. So we focus sometimes on test taking strategies, even when we're tutoring for school subjects, because the way you need to prove it for your grades in that class are going to matter. How is your math teacher grading these questions? Are you writing out your work in the proper way to maximize points on every exam and quiz? Right. So when we talk about preparing for exams, whether that's a standard exam in the course or an AP exam at the end of the year, we're thinking both form of the test, making sure you're ready for any essay related questions, multiple choice strategy, things like that, and also content, making sure you have that knowledge that you're going to need to show. Either way, I really recommend starting sooner rather than later if it's necessary. We get a huge, rush of calls in October because that's when the first math unit tests tend to come back. for most of our students. And the phone will be ringing off the hook then. And by then, that grade is part of your grade for the first semester. So if you realize that you're struggling with this material earlier on and you can head it off before you get that poor first grade, whether that's intervening with your friends, with your teacher, or with us, I really recommend trying to get ahead of this.
So, as Jim mentioned, letters of recommendation are also going to be a part of the student's application, right? What is the point of letters of recommendation? So, your grades to a certain extent are going to speak for themselves, right? Admissions officers know what a in a particular AP class or B in an honors class mean at certain high schools, right? And so that's a very objective factor they can use. Standardized test scores, which Jim will talk about a little bit later, is also a very objective measure that the admissions officers use, right? But letters of recommendations are another way for college admissions officers to get to know the student, right? What is the student like? Not just in the classroom, but as a human being. So part of that is building relationships with those teachers, right? Admissions officers want to see students that are going to advocate for themselves. And a perfect way to do that is, hey, being honest with yourself. I'm struggling in a class. It's not going great, right? Like, go to the teacher for extra help. Teachers like to see that. That shows initiative. So it shows a part of the student that might not just be evident by walking into a class that might be easy for them and getting an A. It's about the teachers that truly get to know the student, their personality, that are going to end up writing the best letters of recommendation. So, who should students end up asking? Well, typically it's going to be one to two teachers that are core subject teachers in their junior year. So, the core subjects are math, science, history, English, and a foreign language. Now, why are we talking about this in sophomore year if it's going to be core subject teachers in your junior year? Well, there's a few reasons for that. One is there might be times where students has the same core subject teachers in back-to-back years, right? Your Spanish 2 teacher might be the same as your Spanish 3 teacher. Your geometry teacher from freshman year might end up being your pre-calculus teacher in your junior year, right? So there's a lot of times where students will get the same teachers again, and so those teachers might have a little bit more insight because they've been able to see the student grow for a couple of years. Also, like, Jim, do you want to use an example of a teacher who wasn't necessarily your core subject teacher?
Yeah, yeah. So I actually got an optional recommendation from my track coach. And this is not something we recommend for most students. A lot of students ask, like, should I ask my coach for a recommendation? But I had a very specific circumstance with my application where it made sense for me to ask my track coach for a recommendation. Basically, track and field was my main activity throughout high school, but I was a late bloomer physically. So I was putting a lot of time and work and energy into track and field. But all it said on my activity section of my Common App was JV, JV, JV. Not very impressive, right? Uh, by the end of senior year, I was a captain on the team and the second highest scorer on the team because I hit, a growth spurt at the right time. But that doesn't count for college admissions end of senior year, unfortunately. So for me, I had this activity that I was putting so much of my heart and soul into, and there was no way for that to show up in my transcript because how do you just say like, well, I'm the most dedicated JV track and field athlete of all time? Like that's going to ring hollow to any admissions officer, right? But I was helping my track coach a lot. I was running our fully automatic timing system at invitationals. I was helping run meets. He used to let me supervise the weight room. Any parents in here who are lawyers might have just gotten a chill down their spine for a high school track coach letting a student supervise the weight room, but it was a different era. And the point is, I was given a lot of responsibility because the track coach knew that I was really dependable, but I was just not performing that way in my actual events, right? And I was still putting the time in. I just wasn't very good. So my track coach also happened to be my ninth grade history teacher. Typically, a freshman year teacher doesn't make much sense because of how much students grow from the beginning of high school to the end. And because he was my a ninth grade core subject teacher and also was able to speak about this involvement in my main extracurricular activity in a way that I just would not have been able to replace myself, in that case, it made sense for me to use an optional third recommender, even alongside my two junior year core subject teachers that I was sending as well.
And again, there's a perfect example, right? There's a teacher who had seen Jim in the classroom, but Jim's grade in that class can speak for itself, right? But this is someone who has that level of insight about Jim that other teachers might not have had because other teachers might not have been seeing Jim 2 to 3 hours a day every day after school, right? So there are going to be exceptions to that. In terms of the other person that you won't get a choice of for writing a recommendation for you, it'll be your school counselor, right? So school counselor, college counselor, whatever your school calls it. So this is the person that's been helping you with course selection the past couple of years and is going to go with you throughout the high school process, right? So I'm not saying right now that you need to go in and meet with your counselor every single week or every single month, right? That's not the goal right now. The goal is just to start to build a relationship with that person. So one, if your student doesn't know that person that well, it's always worth it to check in, right? Course selection in sophomore year is a great time to do that. Once they take diagnostic tests for SAT or ACT, right? When you have those major checkpoints throughout the college application process, that's when you can go in, check in with them, give them an idea of what you're thinking in terms of your college process, where you're looking to go. If you have any ideas, if you don't have any ideas, they're great people to ask questions about, right? They've probably worked with hundreds of students from your high school and might have insights about what are good fits for students from your high school, kind of with the activity backgrounds you have, different things like that. So get to know that counselor. That counselor is going to have to write, if you're at a public school, sometimes 150 different recommendations. And so what you want is that person to really get to know you. So your recommendation isn't just sort of a copy and paste. It truly does reflect who you are as a person. And admissions officers can identify that when the guidance counselor has truly gotten to know the student themselves.
Awesome. Okay, so now we get to my favorite part of the presentation and absolute favorite topic to talk about, and everyone else's least favorite, which is standardized testing. Before I jump into this, one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is please use the Zoom Q&A function to ask any questions you all have, and we will stick around at the end to answer whatever questions pop up. So I mentioned that at the beginning of standardized testing on purpose because this tends to be the first section where people generate a lot of those questions. So I like to start by zooming out on standardized testing and just think like, oh, well, what's the point of colleges using standardized testing in admissions in the first place? And simply put, standardized testing is the best way for a college to predict which students will be successful at that university. So colleges are looking for correlations between various admissions factors and their freshman year GPA from students, as well as the percentage chance of that student actually graduating from that institution. And when we compare data on things like GPA, things like standardized test scores, and other quantitative factors, the SAT or ACT test score is the single best predictor of how a student will perform at college. It used to be high school GPA, but with grade inflation comes grade compression, meaning students' grades aren't as different as they were in the past. Whereas standardized test scores are standardized, so they tell the same story over time. Now, the other thing that standardized tests allow colleges to do is compare a student with their local context. When you apply to college with your high school transcript goes something called a school profile. And that contains various information about your high school, things like what AP or IB courses are offered by your high school, things like the percentage of students from your high school who go on to college, things like the average SAT and or ACT score at your high school. And when colleges see that, they're able to get a snapshot of what your high school is like. So this is important. For instance, if you're applying to a college that doesn't generally get many applicants from your high school. So if you're applying from the Philadelphia area to, Penn State, they've seen, probably 20, 30 kids from your high school every year. So they already have a good idea of what your high school is like. If you are applying to, University of Florida from a high school in Florida, it's going to be a similar situation, right? They're going to get so many applicants that they know your high school well. But if you are an applicant from Pennsylvania or Florida applying to a small school in California, they do not probably regularly get many applicants from your high school. And that's where that school profile is really important because they can compare your test score with the average test score of your school to get a sense of your performance relative to people of a similar academic preparation to you. And then finally, it's important to remember that the test score is part of a holistic review process. And what I mean by that is that it is not the end all be all. No one, not even people who love standardized testing like me, think that a single number is a description of a human being. If you want a description of the human being, that's why we have things like letters of recommendation and college essays. That's why we consider more than just a test score. It's an important part of the evaluation, but it's not the whole thing. When we talk about standardized testing policies, there are essentially three. Test optional, which is the broadest. Test optional can mean test very optional. It can mean test not very optional, to put it briefly, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. There's test required, which is very straightforward. You simply must submit an SAT or ACT score as part of your application. Most of the test required schools are large state schools or highly selective schools, but that doesn't mean every large state school and every highly selective school is test required. And then the final policy bucket is test blind or score free. And this is mostly just going to apply to the University of California and the California state systems. So more of a West Coast thing than anything. And these schools won't use an SAT or ACT score, though they actually do consider AP and IB scores in admissions. So test blind is not really accurate. It's more like just SAT and ACT blind. So I mentioned test optional is a broad term that can encompass a wide variety of institutional philosophies, right? So we have test optional schools that admit over 70% of their applicants with test scores. And I picked an example here that's popular with our students, Duke. And so Duke is not very test optional. Most of the students who are admitted to Duke are going to be submitting test scores. On the other hand, you have tests or schools rather that admit fewer than 40% of their students with test scores. And so there, just to give some examples, University of Washington is a popular example on the West Coast, Temple University here in Philadelphia, and then a lot of the smaller state schools. So not your flagship state schools, but smaller state schools are often admitting a lower proportion of students with test scores. So most schools that are very test optional are actually either small liberal arts schools, which were often test optional before everyone else was, before it was cool, I like to say, or schools that aren't very selective, meaning they admit a high percentage of the students who apply. And that's how those smaller state schools fall into that bucket. The bottom line when it comes to test optional, and really all you need to know about it when it comes to 10th grade, is on this slide. A strong test score is still an admissions asset, even in a world where most colleges are test optional. And now what a strong test score is going to vary based on the colleges that you're interested in. But if you submit a score that that college believes is strong, then that's going to help your application. If you're interested in more selective schools, and I think a roughly 15% acceptance rate is a good way to kind of frame this, then it's even more important to have that standardized test score, because to be admitted to these highly selective institutions, you kind of need everything to fall in your favor. They're also more likely to require the score, but even in a test optional context, you're going to have a much easier chance if you could submit a score that they're happy to see. Having the score will expand your options for college choice, because you're going to be generally admitted to more colleges that are test optional. You'll have the option for colleges that are test required. And then it also expands your options for merit scholarships. So if earning scholarships is going to be an important part of your college funding plan, then it is important to have a standardized test score, because often colleges, even test optional colleges, have scholarships that require test scores. Not all scholarships require test scores, but scholarships are actually even more likely than universities to require test scores. And then finally, if the amount of time and effort that it would take to obtain that strong test score is just not worth it, if you're a student with straight A's in the most rigorous courses your school can allow, and your test score is just not going to line up with that, and the amount of time and effort it would take to, get that score to a point where it would help you is just not worthwhile, that you'd have to sacrifice your ability to continue performing well in school, you'd have to sacrifice sleep and your mental health and all of that, then at that point, that's when you consider kind of going test optional as a base plan. But I would say 90+% of students should be planning to test and to do as well as they can on that test. But there are students for whom test optional from the beginning is going to make sense. We have planning calls with all of our families before they start. So if this is you, we will tell you, and we'll recommend kind of other ways we can help you beyond standardized testing to boost your profile as an app. Okay, so I'm talking a lot about the SAT and the ACT, but most people on this call are not going to be taking the SAT or ACT in 10th grade. So let's talk about when you should take it. For most students, they're going to test for the first time junior year. And when in junior year is going to depend on these three factors. So first is Algebra 2 and geometry completion. And this is kind of the most objective factor here. With Algebra 2 and geometry, come your kind of final big pieces of the math that show up on the SAT and the ACT. And that means that if you finished those two courses, then generally speaking, you're ready to take the test. If you will finish them by the end of 10th grade, you can test whenever you want in junior year. And in that case, I typically recommend trying to plan to take the test for the first time earlier in the year. If you are going to take one of those two courses as a junior, then I usually recommend waiting until the spring of junior year to take the test for the first time because you don't want to pay a private tutor things that you're about, to teach you things that you're about to learn in the classroom in a few months. We want to reinforce and fill in gaps with tutoring. We don't want to have to teach a whole year of Algebra 2. It's just not an efficient way to spend your time or money. Now, the other thing to consider here is your extracurricular or real life schedule. So I mentioned that for most students, I recommend, testing in the fall of junior year. And the main reason for that is what I talked about earlier with academics, where the spring is just the busiest time. Our students have the least time to do their test prep work then. So if you can avoid prepping then, it's usually a good idea. The At the same time, if you play, say you play football and wrestle, and those are the only two sports that you do, and spring is your least busy time of year as a result of that, because you don't have 3 hours of practice after school every day, then it might make sense for you to wait until the spring to test for the first time. So I mentioned this, there are kind of general guidelines I can give on what the best timelines are for all this standardized testing stuff, but it's really going to come down to the individual situation. And this is what we work with families on. The other thing to consider is your mental health and workload management. Our philosophy here is spread the stress. You don't want to have a summer where you do nothing but, play Xbox or, play Fortnite, and then you just, stress out all school year because you left every important thing for during the school year, right? You want to instead take advantage of the summer when you have more bandwidth to get ahead on their SAT or ACT prep, to have kind of lower levels of stress more consistently throughout the year rather than having an extremely acute period all at once. When it comes to test dates, these aren't super relevant yet, but I kind of batch them and I've color coded them accordingly. If you plan to prep the summer before 10th grade and take the test in the fall, you're going to be aiming for one of our orange test dates here for SAT or ACT.
Summer
Uh,
before 11th grade. Summer before
Sorry,
11th.
summer before 11th grade. Thank you. Thank you. Summer before 11th grade. Sorry, we're giving a lot of grade specific back to school webinars this week. So I was talking to juniors last night. It'll be ninth graders tomorrow. So I'm a little bit mixed up. If you're prepping the summer before 11th grade and you're taking it in the fall of 11th grade, orange test dates. If you're starting your prep at the beginning of the school year in 11th grade, green test dates here in the middle. If you're prepping for a spring first test date, you're generally going to go for these lavender test dates. And then June and July are also options, but I would not recommend leaving them for your first test date. So they're great options for a retest on whatever timeline you're on, but they're not really what you want to be doing for the first test date. Okay. Um, the test dates, again, this stuff we'll get much more specific about talking to you individually, so I'll just move on from that. One of the biggest questions that we get in the test prep planning process is, well, I heard that some SATs have easier curves or harder curves, right? Like people will ask, well, why should I take the test in the fall of my junior year when a bunch of seniors are taking it then and they break the curve? I don't want to have my score compared to students who are a year older than me who have a year more of math and reading under their belt, right? The truth is that misunderstands the way the SAT and ACT curves work. They're not based on the population of students who test that day. And that's because the testing companies know that it's not the same population of students who test each test date, right? You're getting more seniors in the fall. They know that. So they curve their test based on a hypothetical student population that is mixed 11th and 12th graders. And there will be test dates that have easier and harder curves, but it will not be neatly predictable. So I don't recommend trying to guess which test date is going to be the best for you. Generally, it just means testing more than once probably makes sense to give yourself more of a chance to get a curve that agrees with you a little more. Now let's talk about the two tests. So the SAT is now digital, and I say that, I know, depending on parents, when your older students went through this process, you may or may not have experience with the digital SAT. But essentially, the way it works, you have two sections, reading and writing and math. Each of those consists of two modules on the test. And then you'll get a score for each section out of 800, and that'll be an overall score out of 1600. Now, the biggest challenges on the SAT tend to be that the annotation tools on the SAT are limited relative to their ACT counterparts. And I say that because the ACT you can still take on paper, and nothing beats being able to write what you want wherever you want on the test. I don't just say that as someone who likes to mark things up as I read. I say that because these are concrete test taking strategies we're going to teach you to use your pencil or use the annotation tools in the testing app to your advantage. The verbal questions on the SAT will tend to be a little more challenging than their ACT counterparts. The textual complexity is a little higher. The level of the vocabulary on the SAT is a little higher. And then the SAT has adaptive scoring. So what does that mean? Let me explain. Essentially, every student who takes an SAT section will have a module one that's the same difficulty across the board. Your performance in module one will dictate whether you get an easier module two or a harder module two. And that will dictate where in the overall score curve you land. Now, students often get in their own heads about this adaptive nature of the test, thinking things like, well, should I try to test into the easier second module? Because then it'll be easier to get more questions right. And maybe I can get a higher overall score that way. Let me just say unequivocally, no, that doesn't make any sense. Getting questions wrong on purpose on the SAT is never going to make your score higher. There is no situation where that's true. The adaptive scoring is kind of a distinction without a difference when it comes to the testing experience, because before they separated it out into modules this way, if you missed too many questions at the beginning of the test, you were already locked out of the highest scoring part of the curve, right? So while they do have this gap between the second modules now, it's not that different because your performance on the first module is still dictating your score as much as your performance in the second module is. So get more questions right. That's the answer. But I mentioned that as a challenge on the SAT because some students can kind of get trapped in their own heads about it. The ACT. So the ACT, for any families here who have experience with it, it's changing nationwide. And the first test date that will be fully in the new format is actually in 2 weeks, September 6th. So with the ACT, essentially they're calling it the enhanced ACT. That's ACT's term, not mine. But it means that we have a new format and it's hybrid, meaning students can take it on paper or digitally. We recommend students take the ACT on paper. There are various reasons that I won't bore you with. I'll just say broadly, students test more slowly in ACT's digital application because the test wasn't designed to be a digital test. They made their paper test available in a digital app, but it's a test designed for paper. The SAT was redesigned completely to be a digital test, and that's why the application works really well. It's a seamless user experience. ACT, not the case. Students should take it on paper if they're taking it. The ACT consists of 3 mandatory sections, English, math, and reading, and then 2 optional sections, science, which you should take, and writing, which you should skip. And I'll explain why briefly. ACT has made the science section optional. That's one of the changes with this new version of the test. But the truth is that ACT doesn't actually get to make the science section optional, do they? Colleges decide whether it's optional or not. So BU announced this spring that actually we're test optional. You can choose not to submit an ACT score, but if you submit an ACT score, it must include the science section. So the ACT is optional, but science isn't optional. I say this, it's confusing, right? And the way you're going to keep your options the widest open is by taking the science section. Our data, by the way, shows year over year that our students improve the second most in science across all the 4 sections. So I generally also recommend taking it just because it's a great opportunity to improve. Most students can make pretty big gains in the science section. The writing section of the ACT, skip it. No college uses it. Very straightforward. So my piece of advice is take it on paper with science without writing. The ACT scoring is out of 36. So each of these 3 sections will get a score out of 36. And your overall score will be the average of the 3. And it'll be rounded to a whole number. And then with science, it'll be just reported as its own score out of 36. The challenges on the ACT relative to the SAT are timing and fatigue, first of all, because the ACT asks you to do more questions in less time. Generally speaking, the SAT's questions are more complex, but you get more time. The ACT's questions are more straightforward, but you have to work through more in less time. There's an element of the unknown right now with the ACT because it's a change in format. That won't be so true for 10th graders next year because it will have been around for a whole year. It'll kind of be old news by then. But it will be higher variance than past versions of the ACT because in the redesign, they've made it fewer questions. When you're giving the same scores out with fewer questions, that means that each lucky or unlucky break for you on test day is going to impact your score more. So we are expecting to see a wider range of outcomes possible from a given student on a given day. Not to say the scores will be higher or lower consistently, but if you think, no one scores the same thing every time they take it. So we expect a range of outcomes from a student on a given day. And on this new test, that range will be a little wider than it was on the old test. So how do we decide between the SAT and the ACT? That's the important thing here. The answer is try both and compare the scores. For some of you, you're going to just do way better on one or the other because of the format, the timing, the content differences between the two tests. It's just going to make way more sense for you to focus on one. And that's great. You just take your head start on one test and go for it. By the way, all colleges accept both tests equally. That's probably one of the most common questions I've gotten in my career in standardized testing and test prep planning. If your scores are similar, then we're going to have to look at things with a little bit more of a fine-tooth comb and look at where are your weaknesses, where are your strengths, how do we typically tend to see students with your score profile improve on the two tests. The best time to take diagnostic testing is by the end of 10th grade or right at the beginning of 11th, depending on your testing timeline. So many of our students will take diagnostic testing around the PSAT of 10th grade. And I mentioned that this is especially true for students who are going to want to knock out their prep this coming summer and take the test early in 11th grade. You're going to take the PSAT in October at school. And if you take a diagnostic ACT at that time, then we can compare that ACT diagnostic score with your PSAT score. And we can use that as a way to identify which test is going to be better for you. That means you don't have to redo an SAT diagnostic test in the spring if you wait. So it's just less overall testing time for the students, which they tend to prefer. We offered, though, diagnostic testing for anyone. If your school doesn't offer the PSAT in 10th grade, we can set you up with a diagnostic SAT that you can take at home as well. And based on your scores, we'll provide our test recommendation, feedback on how your student did, and then we'll offer a test prep planning call to walk you through kind of what we would expect in terms of the prep process, what prep with us would look like, and kind of any recommendations, any questions you have about SAT versus ACT, all of it. We often get the question, well, can I just take both the SAT and the ACT? And the answer to that is you can if you want to. But really, if you think about test prep as an investment of, your family's money and your students' time in trying to raise the score as much as possible to increase options for college and scholarship options, well, then you're going to see the best return on that investment if it's focused just in one direction than if it's split in two different directions. So we recommend focusing your preparation on one test or the other. But the truth is, most of these tests test fundamental skills in things like algebra, geometry, reading and writing, right? And commas are commas on either test and triangles are triangles, right? So prepping for one of these tests and building those skills in one test will make you better at the other. So if you want to go ahead and try the other, we won't try to talk you out of it. We'll just emphasize, make sure you're picking one and committing to it in your prep process. It can make sense for very high scorers to try both tests if what you need is kind of any given Sunday, as in you just need to have your best day on the right day to get that incredibly excellent score, then it can make sense to try both.
So now, as we move away from this really objective factor of what test score did you get, right? Now let's move on to extracurricular activities. So this is where students can show their interests outside of the classroom, right? What do you like to do? What do you like to spend your time doing? This can often show colleges and universities what kind of student you're going to be when you get to their campus, right? How are you going to contribute to the overall community? Is it going to be sports? Is it going to be theater? Is it going to be debate? What are the things that you like to do outside of the classroom? Now, it's not about just adding everything to your list, right? It's not about joining 10 different clubs and not really being involved in each one and not spending much time in each one. It's about pursuing the things that truly interest you, right? What are the things that reflect your interests and what you like to do in your spare time, right? So the first step is to find activities that you're interested in and then figure out how to put them on your college application. Now, a lot of times it's easy, right? You might be playing a sport in school. You might be part of the theater program or in band. You might be interested in really some of the clubs that the school has, right? Model UN, debate, robotics, those sorts of things. Those are all great and pursue those. But also if you have interests outside the classroom as well, right? Like figure out how to pursue those in tangible ways. It's not about finding the thing that makes like sounds the most impressive. It's about finding the activities that are most authentic to you and express who you are as a person and then showing how you truly got into them. When you pursue those activities, one, you're going to spend more time on it because you enjoy doing them, right? So a good example is we've had a lot of students in the past who like to work out. So, okay, if you like to work out, you go to the gym every day of the week, not unrelated to one of the sports you're in. Hopefully, gym's not running that gym, but that weight room. But let's say you're doing that, right? And you are part of a sports team. Get some of your friends, get some of the students, maybe you're on varsity, maybe get some of the students on the JV program to join you, right? Learn how to quantify the things that you're already doing outside of the classroom. This will truly show the admission officer who you are. As Jim mentioned earlier, grades look similar across the board at a certain point, right? Test scores that a lot of the most selective universities do at the same point. So this is one of the key ways you can differentiate yourself beyond just the numbers and letters on your transcript. So how can you do that, right? Hopefully you got involved in some activities in ninth grade. You don't have to stay in every single activity you start in ninth grade, and it doesn't mean you can't start new activities in 10th grade. Find out the things that work for you. Maybe you were in a club last year and it wasn't your favorite. It's okay. But pick the other ones that you are and continue to engage in them. Get more involved, right? Have those couple activities that you might be involved with through all of your high school experience. But it's okay to add things later on as your interests change, as maybe there's new opportunities available just as you get further along in your high school experience. So start to build depth in a lot of those activities that you're really passionate about. It doesn't have to be in school. A lot of the things I mentioned, sports, clubs, like are all school based. It could be community based. It could be a volunteering experience. A lot of students start working, whether it be at a camp or kind of at a local job, right? Those all count as extracurricular activities for your college application. Anything that you're spending a large amount of time on that we can quantify is going to be a part of your activity list on your college application. So don't ignore certain things and be like, that doesn't count. A lot of times in personal advising meetings, students will tell me about the clubs they're in, what they're doing in school. And then a lot of times the follow-up question I get, well, I don't know if this counts, but it all counts as long as we can figure out a way to quantify and put it on your application. And different
I actually have something quick to add here, which is something that our colleague Kevin Trudell said to the juniors when talking about extracurricular activities on this same point last night. He was talking with an admissions officer from Duke recently, and the admissions officer from Duke, when asked about extracurriculars, said, think about impact, not leadership. And so I think often students have in their mind, I need to be the president of five different school clubs. And that's how I demonstrate, extracurricular success to a college. But the truth is, impact matters more than a title. And one thing you're going to do on your applications is explain what you actually did as part of these activities. So if you are in some kind of fundraising club, maybe you were the highest grossing fundraiser, right? You weren't the president or the treasurer of the club, but you've been the highest grossing fundraiser every year. That may matter even more to the college than having the title. So I think it's important to remember that what you're doing matters a lot, not just, what is it official or school sanctioned in some way.
And that's a perfect example, right? There are a lot of times there are clubs in school where a student might be a part of it, but it meets 20 minutes a week, right? And there's nothing really engaging outside of those 20 minutes. Stock market club comes to mind as a common one that a lot of kids participate in, right? And so that's one where if you don't have that impact, you might be president of it, but what does that truly mean? So think about that as you work through your college experience. Also, next summer, what is that going to look like for you, right? As Jim mentioned, if you don't have anything else going on, standardized test prep might be a part of it, right? But one of the things that you want to do as you get to the summer after sophomore year, summer after junior year, is to start to figure out how to stay busy or pursue your interests, right? If you're developing an interest in STEM, is there a way you can get involved either in your school or local community, right? What are the things that you can do in the summer to show that you're truly interested in a particular subject? So when you're applying to colleges, colleges can see that you did try to pursue that. You're not just saying, "Oh, I want to do business." Well, why? What drew you to that, right? What sort of experiences do you have that show us that you did truly pursue this particular interest? Now, while you're doing all of this, right, and this is part of your college clubs, you might end up doing some preliminary college research. What does that mean? If you're part of a sports team, and particularly travel teams, you might end up on college campuses for tournaments. If you're in Model UN, a lot of colleges host the conferences on their campuses themselves, right? So you don't need to know where you're going to apply during your sophomore year or even throughout most of your junior year, right? But this is a time when you can start to learn what you like about certain colleges. So if you find yourself on a college campus, right, walk around a little bit, talk to some of the kids who are at that school, right? And see if you can find out some information. You might find out some things you like, some things you don't like. So when you actually start doing your college research, start to actually formulate your college list, then you have a better idea of what you're actually looking for in a college rather than just kind of a big name or a school that you heard of, right? So, and the other thing is with this, depending on where you are, what part of the country you're in, there might be local colleges that you can just start to visit. And again, you might not be interested in going to college 15 minutes from where your high school is, right? And that's completely okay. But that's honestly a great trial run for what a college visit looks like. Most college visits are typically the same. They have an hour tour, an hour info session. Sometimes they swap those around. But the idea is if you visit that school 15 minutes from where you live, well, now you went through that process. There's no pressure associated with it. You knew it wasn't somewhere you're going to apply, but you can start to ask questions and build your own list of these are things that I liked at college 15 minutes away, and these are things I didn't like at college 15 minutes away. So before you do that 6 hour drive to go visit some other schools, you have a list of things that you're looking for so you can make the most out of that drive and out of those longer college visits. Academics will be there, right? You can find the top programs or appropriately matched academic programs in whatever subject that you plan to pursue in college. But you're also trying to find a place you want to live for 4 years, right? And that's why a lot of these other factors come into play that are not just purely academic. Do you like the environment? Do you like being in a city campus? Would you prefer a more kind of college town campus, right? What are the things that you like about where you're potentially going to live for 4 years? Because if you're happy where you live, you're going to be have a better college experience and honestly be a better student when you get there.
Well said. So I'd like to close us out here before we jump to some Q&A with an end of 10th grade checklist. So essentially, what are the things you should be focusing on, to have completed by the end of this year? First and foremost is, get the best grades you can between now and the end of the year. And that would also include scores if you're taking any AP exams. And this is, again, going to be kind of the first and primary goal of the school year is to do well in school. Second is to form a plan for SAT or ACT test prep. It's not time to do test prep yet, but leaving 10th grade and understanding, okay, this is the test date I think I'm going to target. I'm taking the SAT, not the ACT, or vice versa. And this is when I'm going to start my preparation. It just helps make your planning for the next year all that much easier. Identify what extracurricular interests you want to continue to pursue and frankly, any that you want to drop because they're not actually bringing you joy, and start to pursue those with more depth. And then, finally, make sure you're making informed course selection decisions based on your goals when it comes time to do so. So these are really the most important things to be considering for this particular year in high school. Go ahead and screenshot this. And we will now at this point jump to Q&A. I will say that we work with students on personal advising meetings where we help them, orchestrate extracurricular activity plans, work with them on course selection, broader planning for the college admissions process. If you're interested in working with us on that, you can follow the QR code here. Likewise, we also work with students on school subject tutoring for just about any subject. So if your student's interested in that, there's a QR code for that. Otherwise, feel free to drop your questions. I know Karan has been answering questions in the Q&A via text, so you can check there for detailed responses. There are a couple of these I want to highlight out loud, though. One especially, are AP test scores important? My understanding is they are, but it seems like some students don't ever take the tests. And the answer is always, in two words, it depends. But the kind of longer answer to a question like this is colleges understand the grade inflation environment, and being able to kind of prove it next to your A with a strong AP score is valuable. We had the dean of admissions of Emory come out 2 springs ago and mention like we're less trusting of GPAs than ever before. And for that reason, we are leaning on AP scores more than ever in our admissions process. Now, there are schools that care about them more and care about them less, just like anything in college admissions. Schools have their own priorities in this process. But AP test scores are something that at the beginning of my career, about 10 years ago, when I first got into this, they were not a very important admissions factor. And they've steadily gained importance in the admissions world ever since. We had another question just come in. PSAT is for National Merit Scholars. Yes. Is there any other use for the PSAT? So, yes, the PSAT is used to qualify for the National Merit Scholarship, and that would be only the junior year PSAT. So, actually, the PSAT that you take in 10th grade doesn't count for anything at all, officially. As Karan detailed in a typed response, the PSAT, it counts because it helps you determine whether you should take the SAT or ACT. It provides a nice baseline score for you to compare with an ACT score and make a test prep plan, but no college is going to see your PSAT score. So there's not another strong use for it. There are a few competitive summer programs that I've heard of that ask for PSAT scores, but even those are few and far between, and most competitive summer programs that's not true for. But I do know there are some that might ask for a PSAT score. Other than that, and the junior year national merit case, it's truly just a practice test, and it gives you the same information as taking another SAT practice test unofficially would.
One small other caveat that I didn't mention in my type response because it's much more rare. There are some major corporations that do provide scholarship to like children of their employees with strong PSAT scores. So that's the other kind of very small exception that might be available to a student.
That's right. And that is actually technically part of the National Merit Scholarship Program, but it is important. And you can actually see, I think, on National Merit's website, the list of corporations that do it. So you can just search National Merit Scholarship to find that if you work for a big corporation and want to see. Um, okay. If, oh, it looks like that was the question we got live. So I think we're through all of our Q&A. Thank you all so much for joining. If you have any other questions that are more specific to your student, our contact information is here. And we hope to hear from you all soon. Everybody enjoy the remaining couple days of summer before Labor Day here and enjoy the holiday weekend. Thanks. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye, Jim.
Bye.